Hi girls! Today we're going to see Unit 5, expanding your horizons. So I'm going to explain this topic and we already saw it in class, but if you have any questions, please do ask me, okay? The presentation is already in Schoology, so you can check it anytime you want. Okay, so Unit 5, expanding your horizons. So what does this mean? It's mean the meaning is that you want to know a little bit more of other cultures, of other countries, and not only focusing on your own lifestyle. So that's expanding your horizons. It's like thinking outside the box, thinking or trying to think the way that other people think, trying to understand their way of doing things. So all of this is expanding your horizons, okay? So different cultures. Each culture, each country has their own ways to greet each other, their own food, their own clothes, traditional clothes, and they can be different from the ones from our country. So for example, from Mexico, the way that people greet, for example, in Asian countries, some of them, they greet only by bowing, and they don't give kisses on each other's cheeks, or they don't shake hands. So there's different ways of greeting someone, also depending on your relationship with that person. The food and the clothes, I think that's more common, that you know that there's different ways to do this. Okay? Now, relative clauses. I know it doesn't seem like this is related to the topic, but I'm going to explain later. So first of all, what is a relative clause? A relative clause gives us information about the person or the thing that we're talking about. So in a sentence, we have the main clause, that is the thing that we're talking about, and then we have a relative clause. This relative clause gives us information to identify the person or the object that we're talking about. So there are two types of relative clauses, defining and non-defining. Defining relative clauses give us essential information, so things that they give us information that we actually need to identify the person or the object or the place that we're talking about. So for example, the woman who lives next door works in a bank. Here, if we remove the relative clause, who lives next door, we only have the woman who works in a bank. Which woman? We don't know the woman that we're talking about. So that's why the relative clause is important. We know that the woman who lives next door is the specific woman that we're talking about. And then we have non-defining relative clauses. These ones are used only to give us extra information, so information that is not essential, that is not needed to identify the person that we're talking about. For example, Lord Thompson, who is 76, has just retired. So here, we already know, without the relative clause, who is 76, we already know the person that we're talking about, Lord Thompson. So this is only extra information. So we don't actually need this information for us to identify the person that we're talking about. So these are the two types of relative clauses. Here's a table with some information about some specific data that we can use for this. So for example, defining relative clauses, they don't use commas. You don't separate them with commas in the sentence. But non-defining relative clauses, you have to use commas between them, okay? Then we have that. That is can be used with objects or with people when we're talking about objects or people, but only on defining relative clauses. Non-defining relative clauses can't use that, okay? So we can't use the word that with non-defining relative clauses. But with defining relative clauses, we can use that to talk about people or objects. So that's fine. And for defining relative clauses and non-defining relative clauses, when we're talking about objects, we're going to use which or ideas. And when we're talking about people, we're going to use who, okay? And at the end, we have relative pronouns can be omitted. Relative pronouns are who, that, or which. We can just remove them from a sentence with defining relative clauses. In defining relative clauses, we can remove it and it's exactly the same. So we can have, do you like the song I wrote, we can remove which or that and the sentence is still correct. But with non-defining relative clauses, we have to use relative pronouns. So we have to use who or which with the relative clause. If not, it's not correct. We're not going to use non-defining relative clauses in this unit, but it's important for you to know. Now, how is it related to the topic that is talking about different cultures? We can use relative clauses to talk about how we feel about different cultures. So for example, something I'll be worried about is the local food. Or we can also have something that I'll be worried about is the local food. But we can also change the order of this sentence with the relative clause going at the end of the sentence instead of at the beginning. So we can also have the local food is something I'll be worried about. So we can have both of them and they are both correct. This is the structure for a relative clause and the complete sentence. So for example, we can use something or one thing that I'll be anxious about is the food. Remember that the relative pronoun that or which is optional, so we can remove it from the sentence and it's still correct. That can be used with objects and with people, and which can only be used with objects or ideas. Okay, so things that are not people. Then we're going to use I would be. Be will be the verb for the relative clause. We can use other verbs, so we're going to see that later. But when we use adjectives, we are going to use the verb to be. Okay, and the adjective and the preposition. So all of this, you have to remember them. And at the end, we have the main clause. Is going to be used when we have a singular object, and are is going to be used when we have a plural. Remember that. And something and one thing can only be used, well, at the beginning of a sentence, can only be used with singular objects or ideas. But we can also talk about plural objects or people. So we can also use some things that I will really miss are the food, are the mountains. Sorry about that. So if you're going to use some things, then the thing that you're talking about has to be plural. For example, here, the mountains. And we can change the verb. As I mentioned before, we can use other verbs beside be. So we can also use agree, disagree, miss, need, and other verbs, for example, here that we have in the table. And we can also talk about people. So we can use the people that I'll miss the most are my parents. That would be plural. But we can also use singular. The person that I'll miss the most is my boyfriend. So for example, that would be an example, okay? So we can talk about singular objects, singular persons, plural objects, or plural people, okay? Then we can change the order, as I mentioned before. We can have the relative clause at the beginning of the sentence or at the end of the sentence, and both are correct. So we can say something that I would be anxious about is the food. But we can also say the food is something that I'll be anxious about. Remember, the relative pronoun is optional. So we can remove that, which, or who. We can remove it and it's still correct. Oh, wait, I forgot to mention. We remember that you have to use which only with objects and who only with people, okay? And what about talking about manners and customs? So when you visit another country, you have to act in some specific ways as not to be rude or to be considered a little bit more polite, okay? So that to show that you have manners. So we can use some specific words to talk about manners and customs that are different to the ones that we usually know. So we can use when and if clauses. So at the beginning of a sentence, we can have when you visit someone, if you want to bring others, if you visit someone. So we can have all these ways to say the same sentence. And then we're going to have the rest of the sentence on the custom and the manner that you're supposed to do. So we use the simple present in these sentences because the actions are generally true. Remember that simple present is used, the tense is used with things that are usually or generally true. Okay? So we use the base form of the verb after the expressions of expectations. What expressions? Be accustomed to, be supposed to, be expected to, or be acceptable to. We can also have the negative for these ones. So it isn't accustomed to, it isn't supposed to, it isn't expected to, or it isn't acceptable to. Okay, so we can also have the negative ones for these ones. And after these expressions, we are going to use the base form. So the verb to be is going to be in simple present, and the verb after these expressions is going to be in the base form. So when you receive a present, you are supposed to hold it with both hands. Receive and are going to be in simple present, and the verb after the expression is going to be in the base form, hold. If a friend invites you to dinner, it isn't acceptable to be late. So for example, invites and isn't is going to be in simple present, but the verb after the expression for expectation is going to be in the base form, be. Okay, so here we're not going to change this verb. It's going to be in the base form. And here we can also change the order of the sentence with a change in the meaning. So for example, you can say, when you receive a present, you are supposed to hold it with both hands. But you can also say, you are supposed to hold the present with both hands when you receive it. And both are going to be correct. Just remember that when we have when or if at the beginning of the sentence, then you're going to use a comma to separate the both parts of the sentence. Okay? And when we have it in the middle of the sentence, then you don't need to add a comma. And if you receive a present, you are supposed to hold it with both hands. You are supposed to hold the present with both hands if you receive it. So all these 4 sentences are correct. All of these have the exact meaning, and you can use them in the same context. Just remember, you're going to have to use a comma when you start with when or if in the sentence. Okay? And that's it for this topic. If you have any questions about this, please do ask me. Anyway, we're going to, for the exam, it's going to be a text with some customs and some traditions and things like that. And you're going to have a multiple choice. So you're going to have to read really carefully and try to check which one is correct. Okay? So be careful with the exam. Remember, the exam is going to be the next Friday. So good luck.